Hello everyone, my name is Teresa Torzicky. I'm representing the initiative BID, Strengthening Education Together. We are an initiative founded around a year ago by a group of around 100 people from all different kind of fields and roles in education. And our main interest is improving the Austrian education system, and we're suggesting a special form of participatory process for doing so. Today I'm really happy to present to you our current status of the project under the title Dialogue in Transition, Navigating the Challenges of Digitalization and Social Segregation in the Parliamentary Context, and how this talk is connected to the session Dialogue, Deliberation, Representation under Pressure at the Day of Parliamentary Research. Dialogue as the guiding principle of democratic processes needs time to develop, and in a time of technologically accelerated communication in a society that is highly segregated and politically polarized, democracy, its processes and its institutions are challenged. New challenges ahead always needs new ideas. But at first, before we are able to propose proper ideas, what we need is a proper understanding of the challenge itself. So as mentioned already, dialogue, or actually the quality of communication, is degrading. But this is not the only thing that we're seeing which is putting democracy under stress, because what we are also seeing is that the landscape of political parties is getting more and more diverse currently and also over the past decades. For Austria, we can even put this very easily into numbers if we take a look at elections. If you compare, for example, the number of parties in the Austrian parliament and the percentage of voters that were represented by the government in 1966, then you had 3 parties in the National Assembly, and the 2 parties who actually formed the government represented over 90% of all voters. In 2024, if you looked at the same things again, you actually had 5 parties which were represented in the National Assembly, and the former long-term governing parties who were back then able to represent over 90% of all voters were for the first time not able anymore to form a coalition without a third partner. So to summarize this, we can say that the number of possibility to form coalitions is on the rise, which of course destabilizes or brings a higher volatility to the system that we are currently having. Besides that, what we also see is that the number of people without a voting right is continuously on the rise. If you take a look at the elections in Vienna, for example, you can see that this time approximately 1/3 of the population was not allowed to participate. Last but not least, the overall polarization is on the rise, which leads to less satisfaction with governments and can also lead to shortened legislation periods. So if we want to summarize the challenge once again, we can say that the competition between political parties is becoming stronger due to the mentioned aspects, which also leads to election campaigns and an overall political communication in general that is more and more populistic, overly emotionalizing, and also neglects long-term thinking and planning. So as we described now the challenge ahead, we also of course want to take a closer look at possible new ideas which bring solutions. And every new idea that actually brings a solution needs to be able to answer a question. In our case, the question ahead is how can we foster spaces where political parties and citizens can foster together long-term visions and implementation strategies for these visions to address current challenges. As mentioned before, the initiative BID has always a focus on education, so the topic of interest for us is education, of course. This is also why we are suggesting with the BID 1000 process, a dialogue process for over a year, which aims to generate a space for discussion for the education community in Austria in order to foster these long-term visions and strategies. So let me roughly explain the idea of the BID 1000 again. Where we actually started was that we thought if the political parties need to focus more and more on winning communication competitions or actually elections, then what we need to generate are new spaces where dialogue can happen with more focus on inclusiveness and on long-term planning and strategies. So BID 1000 actually stands for Broadening Educational Involvement Through Systemic Dialogue. And what we want to implement is a 1-year-long process for 1,000 people from the education sector in Austria, where the goal is that with this dialogue between policymakers, representatives from all political parties in the Austrian National Assembly, educators, people from administration, teachers, students, civic society, including parents, of course, that when we bring all of these people together and give them enough space and time, that actually democratic processes can do their magic and generate solutions which are first of all better addressing the overall problem like perceived by all people, and which also are better accepted when the time of implementation comes. So for this talk today, what we want to dive deeper into is the question what we actually need to make a process like that reality. And of course, beside things like political commitment, money, experts, and many other things, is what we actually need to understand is how political dialogue and communications are working and what are success factors for proper political dialogue. So what makes a communication actually a good experience with a proper outcome is the main question which is guiding us in all the work that we are having ahead of us in the study that I'm currently describing to you. Because as mentioned before, we want to do this dialogue process with 1,000 people. So what we really need to generate is a proper understanding of communication in political processes, in dialogue processes, and in the interaction process of politicians with citizens. So we try to bring this into structured research questions so that we can more easily take a closer look into the topic. And what we're actually asking ourselves is which factors are fostering successful communication and thereby supporting also the forming of an informed opinion by participants, and how this is actually working between two people in case that they are in similar roles, in case that are in different roles, in case that they have similar opinions, or also in cases where they might have opposing opinions. Of course, two people is the easiest case that we are having when we are looking into political communication. We always have communication where lots and lots of people are involved. So of course we want to take a closer look into group effects that you might have in these settings. And when it comes to parliamentary context, it's also quite important to take a look into settings where you have direct discussion. For example, when representatives from different parties are discussing with each other, but also how the communicative processes work when these discussions are transported to third parties or other people via media. This leads us also to the second big question: how does digitalization change these interactions actually? I mean, of course, as also mentioned on one of the slides before, digitalization is usually putting more speed into processes, and proper dialogue where people are able to form opinions is usually something where time is essential. So one thing that we can say for sure is that digitalization is changing something, but what we want to look more closely into is what exactly is changing and how one could actually also be able to counteract effects that we currently do not want to have so much. Last but not least, in our study, we want to talk with the people who are present in the system about their experiences in the current situation and how they perceive the process. Is it like always? Did they notice any change over time? And what are their personal experiences? And on the groups that we want to focus are mainly politicians, journalists, and voters. So it's all about communication, and basically for being able to properly discuss this with each other, we want to take a closer look at the different types of communications that there actually are between two individuals. So in overall, what we want to talk about is 4 different types of communication, where we have dialogue, debate, discussion, and monologue. And if you take a look at those 4, the actual differences can be seen if you take a look at the goal of the interaction, the tone during the process, and the outcome. When it's about dialogue, it's actually that two individuals are interacting with each other in order to generate understanding, connection, work on a relationship, where the tone during the process is mostly respectful and open, and the outcome is something like a shared meaning, empathy for each other, a shared view on something, and an improvement in the relationship. One could maybe say that the debate is more or less the opposite of it, because it's not about generating understanding and connection, it's about who is winning. And therefore, of course, the tone is also competitive, and the outcome can either be victory or defeat. And one can also argue that actually the result of a debate can be something where in the end lots of dialogue is needed in order to be able to have proper debates in the future again. When we take a closer look at discussion, one could say that this is really more focused on the actual topic, where the goal of the interaction is to explore a topic together or to solve a problem together, and the tone during the process might be more distant because it might be very, very analytical, goal-oriented, and less focused on the relationship level. If the discussion is successful, then you have as an outcome something like a decision or a conclusion. And during our discussions in our initiative, we often came to the conclusion that if people do not know each other before, you actually need a form of dialogue before you're actually able to go into a discussion. The 4th kind of interaction between two individuals that we're having here on the slide, the monologue, is slightly different than the other 3, because you have a designated talker and a designated listener in this setting, where one person is expressing one view, where the tone during the process can be something like lecturing in a way, and it's totally clear one-way transmission of an opinion or an information. Often when media gets involved, then also settings which could in generally be something like a dialogue, a debate, or a discussion often turn into a monologue if there are no options for responding. For example, like you're having it here in the setting that we're having right now. So beside that, there are these different forms of communication. We also have other factors that really characterize the interaction between two individuals. And one of them is the actual reason for interaction. So when looking into literature and talking to people, we found like 5 major reasons for individuals to interact and to communicate with each other, and summarized them here on the slide for you. So one reason is simply to strengthen relationship and trust. And when looking at the information that you had on the slide before, one easily can figure out that the dialogue is the proper form of communication for reaching that goal. When we are at reason number 2 and 3, where it's about increasing knowledge or creating something new together, we always will need to take discussion as a form of communication, especially when it's about creating something new together, like ideas, hypotheses, theories, mental models, actions, or also concrete plans which can be implemented. When it's simply about learning, then it might also be settings where it's more about a monologue, especially when you have a setting where you have one expert and somebody who wants to learn about the system. But what I really would like to mention is that we often say, and especially when we look into school and learning at school, that learning is actually a social process. So without a relationship between student and teacher, lots of learning processes cannot happen as good as they can if there is a relationship. So in that case, when it comes to learning, also a mixture of dialogue and monologues, less discussion might be the appropriate thing to do. Reason number 4, when it comes to reasons to interact with each other or to communicate with each other, is actually the question about social status. Like figuring out who am I and who are you when we're interacting with each other. And this is where we often end up in a debate, when we want to figure out like who is knowing more about something, who is better able to defend his or her opinion in a certain setting. And here we actually really have this setting as described before, where it's not so much about the outcome of the talk and about the relationship of the people, but simply figuring out who's winning. Last but not least, among the reasons why people actually interact is the fact that we are enjoying it. And since people are very different, of course, here the only answer, like which type of communication can best provide this joy, it really depends. For some it might be the dialogue, others might really thrive when it comes into discussions, and for other people the debate might be the thing what actually really floats their boat. So how we are communicating and why is playing a major role if we want to describe and characterize the different forms of communication that we are seeing. But what is also playing a critical role when two individuals are interacting is their opinions. Because opinions often reflect values. And of course we can imagine that if I talk with somebody who's having the same opinion as I have, or if I'm talking to somebody who's having a different opinion than I have, especially when I feel very strongly about something, that this makes an overall difference to the way how we are interacting. So in our work so far we defined 6 different cases of interaction, where we take into consideration if the individuals have a similar opinion or an opposing opinion, and if the topic is important to both of them, to only one of them, or if it's unimportant to both of them. So in case we have a topic where we have 2 people who are having a similar opinion and both feel very strongly about the topic, then it's kind of likely that we end up with a mixture of dialogue and discussion. Because the 2 people will basically interact and join the conversation, and as soon as they figure out that they have a similar opinion about it anyway, it's kind of likely that maybe they will see if they can get to know each other some little bit better, and it's unlikely that you end up with a debate or something like that. In case you have the same situation but opposing opinions, the most likely outcome is that you will either have a debate where it's about who's right and who's wrong, or in case this whole thing gets too heated up, you might end up with a stop of communication. When you have the case that the topic is important for one individual and not so much for the other one, and both are having similar opinions, then the most likeliest outcome is that you'll end up with a mixture of dialogue and monologue, with the one feeling more strongly about it, taking more the initiative and talking more, while the other one might listening more. If this is the case with opposing opinions, you will have something which might be a mixture of debate/monologue or stop of communication, again in a situation where the overall interaction is too heated up, too polarized. If we get into the case that we have two individuals which do not feel very strongly about a topic, and both of them have a similar opinion, it might be the case that the real conversation about this topic might not even really start. It might more start with a dialogue and end up kind of likely very quickly in the stop of communication, which is more or less the same when it comes to the stop of the communication when you have two individuals involved with opposing opinions. One last thing I want to mention at this slide is that we figured out the stop of communication is not always the same as the stop of the communication, because one could describe here like three different cases where you have something like a friendly coexisting, an ignoring coexisting, or a hostile coexisting. If you take a closer look at the cases that are described before, if you have the stop of communication in the situation where you have two individuals with a similar opinion, but both of them do not feel very strongly about the topic, then it's most likely something like a friendly coexisting, because there's actually no reason to argue, there's actually no real reason for a conflict, and one could say that if these two individuals will in the future interact with each other again, there shouldn't be a problem about this. If on the other hand you take a look at cases where you have different opinions, but it's still something where people do not feel so strongly about it, or the case where one might be feeling strongly about it but the other not, you might end up with something like this ignoring coexisting, where one can say like the people, if they will in the future meet each other again and have the task of working with each other again, they will more likely try to not do this or to find ways to solve the problem without being in need of the other one. While in the third case, when you have something like a hostile coexisting, which can often happen if in this case here, where you had two individuals with opposing opinions who both feel very strongly about the topic, then and you had a stop of communication, then it's kind of likely that you will end up with a hostile coexisting. Differentiating between these three different types is actually only important if you aim for overcoming this stop of communication for what reason soever. So everything said about communication so far is becoming another interesting component when we take a special look on the parliamentary context, because a case that we want to observe there and put more focus on is actually the hierarchical communication between political representatives and citizens. And again, here we want to look into the reason for the communication from the point of view of the politician and also from the point of view of the citizen, and see what we can learn from that. So why do politicians actually communicate or talk, and thereby also represent the will of state, as we will learn on the next slide? So the main reasons is to gain trust, to transport the message, or to explain why the current plans ahead are the best to improve the situation in the country in the current situation. And if we summarize those three, we will always end up with the aim to ultimately stay in power, stay in government, be re-elected. If we take a closer look at the citizen, then the basic needs, which are the reason behind communicating and often listening in that case, is to see who is actually representing me, to actually seek who can promise me a good life, and to gain information about what comes next and why it's necessary and important. If we summarize these needs, then we end up in summary with the goal to want to form an opinion about the politician or the party. And actually the reason why the citizen wants to form an opinion is for further elections and similar situations. So if we take a look at the interaction here, one could already figure out that from a hierarchical point of view, you usually have more or less in our current system a monologue setting. But if you wouldn't have that, then what you would actually choose as a way of interacting is, for the first thing, the dialogue, because gaining the trust and seeing who represents me would be something which is really more on a relationship level. While when it comes to transporting the messages and explaining current plans, of course, in the current setting, you end up with a monologue. But this could be maybe also something where actually the discussion or something like more opportunities or possibilities to ask a question by the citizens could actually improve the interaction. If we take a closer look at this here, and we take a look at it from the point of the politician, it actually becomes kind of clear why populism is so common nowadays and so easy to do. Because when it's about gaining trust, it's more or less about appearing like a person who might be the one which actually looks like a representation of the citizen. And when it's about transporting a message, the message that the other person for sure wants to get is the promise of a good life. So easy messages are always easy to transport, and explaining why current plans are really necessary is always something where you need a lot of attention by the listener. So this is often skipped anyway, as already mentioned in the slides above. In our current situation where we have lots of polarization, lots of populism and other similar factors dominating the political discussion. So as already mentioned on the last slide, and during our discussion on this topic and on our work on the BID 1000, this theoretical model came in handy with the basic three terms that I want to explain to you now, with will of state, will of citizens, and public opinion, where one says in a democracy you have the will of the citizens, which is actually expressed through elections, and as soon as the citizens elect the representatives, then actually the elected representatives govern and therefore create something like the will of state. So if everything works out now well, then will of state and will of citizens is approximately the same, or at least very similar. And the intermediary between the two of them, where also during legislation periods interaction can happen, is the public opinion. So all in all, the description for the public opinion is that it's formed through debates in the parliament, where actually the elected representatives debate the issues and the different opinions that citizens might have, and with the citizens having the possibility or option to watch the discussion and form their own opinion, where these different types of opinion, like the will of the state and the will of the citizens, are also bridged. So one hypothesis in the current situation is that this intermediary function of the public opinion has changed a lot due to digitalization and digital technologies, because you have mass media, you have social media, you have factors that are driving social segregation, and these can have a lot of influence on the gap between the will of state and the will of the citizens, and what actually happens when the will of the citizens and the will of the state is too far apart in a legislation period, then shortened election periods are the actual outcome. So we looked so far on our topic of dialogue in transition very much from a theoretical point of view, but of course theory is only one thing when you want to analyze a challenge ahead in order to suggest a solution. So I want to also present to you some numbers that we were taking into account when working on the BID process, and they are all taken from the Democracy Monitor 2024, which is why the graphics are actually in German, but I will try to translate the main findings into English. So on this slide here, you see information about the satisfaction of the Austrian citizens with the political system over time. And the three different lines that you can see in the different colors are actually showing groups of people according to different incomes. What you can actually see since 2022, which is rather an interesting development, is that the third of the population with the lowest income is actually getting less and less satisfied with the current political situation. And nearly 80% of the people in this group state that the functioning of the currently politically system is not so well or not working at all, which is somehow a little bit alarming, I would say, or at least something where it would be very much necessary to take a closer look into why it is like that. I think especially interesting this is also when you take into account the information on the next slide, because on this slide you can actually see that the overall interest into democracy and its processes is there. Yeah, so even though people feel less and less represented, and especially people from the third with the lowest income have less and less trust in the system, there is nevertheless the answer on many questions that people would actually like to know more, because the color coding of this slide here is that the dark blue is people answering the question with "I'm already well informed," while the middle dark blue is the percentage of people who answer that they would actually like to know more, while on the other side you have people who are not really interested or who did not give any answer at all. And in summary, you can say it's always over 50% of the people saying, like, I would like to know more about how legislation is made on Austrian level and on European level, how the parliament is controlling the government, what are actually my own options as a citizen to contribute suggestions for legislation, and how I can bring in my own opinion about current things under discussion. So I personally believe this is really interesting, because on the one hand you have a lot of people saying, or an increasing number of people saying, that the current system is not functioning anymore. But it's not because they are tired of democracy. It's more or less because they do not know enough about it, and they actually want to know more, or that they have the feeling that there are too much obstacles for them to actually participate, which altogether supports the approach that we are following at the initiative BID, where we say for real long-term strategies which are supported by political parties and citizens alike, we need new forms of interaction and participation. So when talking about options how to increase interest, trust and participation of the citizens into democratic processes, then the Citizens' Assembly is for sure a model that we need to look into. The basic idea behind the Citizens' Assembly is that you select in a random manner a group of people that represents the population living in the country where the Citizen Assembly take place. And after selecting this group, you gather them to discuss specific problems, negotiate possible political solutions, and formulate recommendations in order to communicate them to the political decision makers. Some of you might know the climate citizens assembly that has been taking place during the last legislation period, which is a good example for a citizens assembly, but there are of course also many other examples in different countries. As every newly suggested approach or idea, also the citizens assembly have positive aspects and negative aspects, and to only name the positive aspects very roughly, it's you have the possibility of the direct interaction with the people who are actually impacted by the proposed measures, which also gives an increased legitimacy for decision makers when proposing measures. Of course, it's also that you can foster mutual understanding through these participatory processes and actually create a space where citizens really go with their discussions through this finding a common democratic will. Last but not least, it also is argued that the probability of a successful implementation due to better acceptance of a measure increases when citizens' assemblies are held, because basically if there are any problems, conflicts or any other things, they can be identified quite early, and the knowledge about it can be integrated in generating a proper solution. On the other hand, there are also some unwanted effects of citizens' assemblies, like there is a huge discussion about the limited democratic legitimacy of citizens' assemblies, because basically only a very small group is involved and they are not elected like the representatives that we currently have in the parliamentary context. And it's always the question if a recommendation by such a small group without any democratic legitimacy should really influence political decisions. Beside that, you have the risk of tokenism, so that basically everything we do with the Citizens' Assembly might only be symbolic, and the ideas generated and the things suggested will not influence the real political process, which is of course very frustrating for the citizens who actually are part of the process. What you also have, which is actually a challenge that also our representative democracy is having, is the question of, do we really have a good representation of the population in this? And even if we have random selection mechanisms, how do we make or how do we make sure that we do not have any other unseen barriers in the process where people with special needs or other things cannot participate due to the way how the discussions are structured, how information is presented, etc. Last but not least, one thing which is always discussed, if you have the Citizens' Assembly as an additional process in democratic processes, of course, if you want to do it in a good way, it costs time and money, and therefore it is always argued if the current results really show enough positive effects to support investing the money in these kind of things. So if we summarize this slide, then I would say citizens' assemblies are actually a good step into solving many of the issues that we have mentioned before on the theoretical level and that have been also shown in the data from the Democracy Monitor 2024. But there are also certain challenges which cannot be addressed so well, which are occurring mainly through our current times with a lot of social segregation and polarization and this degrading of quality dialogue due to digitalization. And this is also why with the BID-1000 we would like to suggest a bit of a different approach, which is actually trying to develop the idea of the citizens' assembly further by really saying we are taking a bigger number of people and we're making sure we have this good random representation that you have in the citizens' assembly, but we directly let them interact with the formal structure of our current political system, namely the elected political representatives from all parties and the representatives of administration. So to conclude my talk, I would actually come back to the BID-1000 approach, the process that we're actually suggesting by the initiative BID Strengthening Education Together, because we talked with different politicians about it, what they think about this participatory process, and the general feedback was really good. And in general, they said that this idea of a one-year-long Austrian-wide dialogue process in order to generate a long-term strategy for the Austrian education system is something that for sure should be tried out and see what we can learn from it. If you want to take a look into the interviews, you can find them all on our YouTube site under the name Bildungspolitik im Dialog, and we were very happy that we had interviews with like 19 former and active politicians from all different kind of parties about our initiative and also the dialogue process we are suggesting. Last but not least, I want to give you an outlook about our next steps, because all the theoretical models I presented to you and also the data, a group of our initiative of around 100 people will take a deeper look into this and try to generate an even better understanding on what is really needed and necessary for generating these spaces of constructive dialogue, discussion, and maybe also a little bit of debate during our BID-1000 process. And for doing so, we are now in the next phase interviewing politicians, journalists, and scientists and citizens about their experiences with the current political discourse and what they like about it, what they might dislike, and how they think that the effects of digital media are changing the political dialogue. And everything that we are actually learning for this from this process are suggestions and measures that we're taking into the improvement of the political discourse and the structures during the BID-1000. So as mentioned at the beginning of the talk, the main goal of this study is to generate learnings for our process in the end. So last but not least, I want to thank you for your attention. I hope there was one or more interesting thoughts in this talk under the title of Dialogue in Transition, Navigating the Challenges of Digitalization and Social Segregation in the Parliamentary Context. and we are looking forward to some interesting dialogue, constructive discussion, and maybe also some respectful debate with you. And you can reach us under the email addresses you see here on the slide. So thank you and have a nice day.